Imagine waking up, checking the news, and seeing this headline: President moves to arrest the Fed chair. Not fire, not complain on Twitter, arrest. The guy who sets interest rates. That is basically the road we are walking down right now. Grand jury subpoenas, criminal investigations, and the very real question: can a president actually throw Jerome Powell in jail if he doesn't cut rates? And if he can, what does that do to your mortgage, your stocks, your job, the dollar, literally the entire global financial system? Welcome back to the comment section with Thomas Paul, where we talk about money, power, and whatever fresh chaos Washington serves up for the markets. Let's start with what's actually happening, because this sounds like a conspiracy theory cooked up on Reddit, but it's very real. Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, puts out this unprecedented public video. Calm tone, central banker energy, but the message is insane. Federal prosecutors have opened a criminal investigation into him. The official pretext? His testimony to Congress about a multi-billion-dollar renovation of the Fed's headquarters, plus how the Fed has been setting interest rates. Behind the scenes? The story is, the Fed has been keeping rates higher than the president wants, and the White House is furious. The administration wants much lower rates, much faster, heading into an election. So instead of the usual political pressure, we're talking subpoenas. A grand jury. The Department of Justice looking at whether Powell committed perjury when he testified about the renovation costs and the Fed's decisions. And here's where it gets wild. If a grand jury indicts Powell, that's not just a slap on the wrist. In theory, it's handcuffs, mugshot, the person in charge of the world's most important central bank under criminal prosecution while markets are open. Think about that. Every portfolio, every bank, every government that treats U.S. Treasuries as the risk-free asset suddenly has to price in political hostage situation at the Fed. So, yes, the president is not literally walking into the Eccles building with a pair of cuffs, but using criminal law as a pressure tool? That's how you get to the question in the title. Can he effectively jail Powell for not doing what he wants on rates? And here's where things get even scarier if you actually care about finance and not just drama. This is not a normal policy fight. This is about whether the Fed is independent at all. For decades, the rule has been, elected politicians do fiscal stuff, taxes, spending, stimulus checks, and the Fed does monetary policy, interest rates, money supply, fighting inflation. The whole point of making the Fed independent is that politicians love cheap money. They want rate cuts before elections, then someone else can clean up the inflation hangover later. When central banks become puppets, history is very clear on what happens next. Short-term sugar high. Then inflation, currency crises, and the fun new game called, why is grocery shopping costing me my kidney? Countries that went down that path? Argentina, Turkey, Venezuela, Zimbabwe. The playbook is always the same. Leader wants growth, jobs, cheap loans, demands rate cuts, bullies, or replaces the central banker, prints money to juice the economy, and then, shockingly, the currency implodes. And now you have the President of the United States signaling, if you don't give me the interest rates I want, I will consider criminally prosecuting you. If you're thinking, yeah, but is this actually real or just political theater? You're asking the right question. Let's pull out the key takeaways from what we know so far. First, yes, there are real grand jury subpoenas involved. The Fed and Powell have reportedly been served. That means prosecutors are gathering documents and testimony. This is not some random rumor. Second, the stated legal angle is super specific and weirdly convenient. They're poking at whether Powell misled Congress about the cost of the Fed's $2.5 billion HQ renovation and about how interest rate choices were made. Is that a legit area for oversight? Sure, Congress can and should ask questions, but does it rise to criminal probe into the central bank chair, right when the White House is raging about rates being too high? That timing is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Third, Powell's response basically screams, this is political. In very polite central banker language, he's saying, no one is above the law, but this is unprecedented. Fourth, this comes on top of years of presidential attacks on Powell. We've already seen threats to fire him, legal theories about demoting him, endless public bashing for not cutting rates to 1%. The Fed has already taken rates down from their peak, trying to thread the needle between inflation and recession. But the White House seems to want emergency-level rates in a non-emergency economy. And now they're escalating from tweets to subpoenas. And here's the last key takeaway you need to lock in. Once markets think a president can personally destroy a central banker for not playing ball, the trust that underpins the dollar is not the same anymore. Because your 10-year Treasury yield is not just about inflation expectations, it's also about whether investors believe the US is still a rules-based system, or if we just joined the Tin Pot Strongman Club. But wait, it gets even wilder when you zoom out to the macro picture. We're heading into a period where everyone is already whispering about a 2025 to 2026 slowdown or outright recession. You've got massive government debt and interest costs that explode if rates stay high. Corporations facing a refinancing wall, billions in cheap old debt rolling into higher new debt. A housing market twisted by high rates, institutional landlords, and crazy mortgage structures. Stock markets that have been riding on a handful of mega-cap winners. In that environment, imagine the president says, "I want rates way lower now," or the Fed chair gets the legal guillotine. If Powell caves and cuts rates aggressively just to survive, markets might party for like 5 minutes. Stocks up, crypto up, meme coins to the moon. But under the surface, global investors start asking, are US interest rates now just an election tool? Is inflation about to reignite? Is the risk-free rate actually political risk now? That is the kind of question that moves trillions out of dollars, out of treasuries, and into gold, commodities, maybe even Bitcoin. Not because crypto bros won, but because the US just downgraded itself from adult in the room to guy yelling at the central bank on live TV. On the flip side, if Powell holds the line, refuses to budge, and the legal process escalates, you could see a sell-off in risk assets as investors price in institutional chaos, higher yields on treasuries as a Fed independence risk premium gets baked in. Other countries, Canada, Europe, whoever, quietly saying, maybe the dollar shouldn't be the only grown-up reserve asset anymore. In other words, whether Powell wins or loses politically, the signal to the rest of the world is, the Fed is no longer off limits. And that's the part regular people need to care about. This is not elite drama with no consequences. If the White House can bully the Fed into cutting right into an inflationary environment, you feel that at the grocery store, at the gas pump, in rent. If the Fed resists and we get higher yields, institutional panic, and a confidence shock, you feel that in your 401k, your job stability, your borrowing costs. Either way, this isn't just about two old guys beefing. It's about whether monetary policy is still long-term and boring, or becomes just another campaign promise with a side of subpoenas. So what should you actually watch next instead of just doom-scrolling headlines? First, watch Treasury yields and the dollar. If global investors decide US institutions aren't what they used to be, that shows up as dollar down, yields up, gold up, and maybe a bit into Bitcoin and commodities as hedges. Second, watch how other politicians respond. If Congress, both parties, pushes back hard and defends Fed independence, that's a sign the system still has some guardrails. If it's all just tribal cheering and no institutional defense, that's a big red flag. Third, watch the Fed's own behavior. Do rate decisions suddenly look a lot more generous to the White House timeline? Do statements become more cautious, more political? Or do they basically say, we'll take the hit, indict me if you want, we're sticking to the mandate? Fourth, time horizon. Everyone loves the hot take, crash tomorrow. In reality, the damage from this kind of institutional erosion sometimes takes months or years to fully show up. It's more like a termite problem than a meteor strike. You don't see it every day, but eventually the floor gives way. So, back to the title question, can Trump actually jail Jerome Powell? Legally, the president doesn't have a magic arrest button for the Fed chair, but if his Justice Department pushes a criminal case and a grand jury indicts Powell, then yes, Powell could face real criminal jeopardy for doing his job the way every modern central banker is supposed to do it. The scarier part isn't one man potentially going to court, it's the precedent. If politicians learn they can use the threat of prison to control interest rates, then independent central bank becomes a historical phase we talk about in past tense. And once that trust is gone, rebuilding it can take decades. In the meantime, You pay the price in higher borrowing costs, weaker currency, and markets that flinch every time a politician gets mad at a rate decision. This is not financial advice, legal advice, or political advice. It's for education and entertainment only. Don't make investing decisions based solely on YouTube. Talk to a qualified professional, do your own research, and don't bet your portfolio on any one headline, no matter how insane it sounds. All right, that's it for today on the comment section with Thomas Paul. What do you think? Is this a real institutional crisis, or just another outrage cycle that markets will shrug off? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more straight talk breakdowns like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.